Jason, welcome back.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerability and exposure management and prioritization and all the great stuff that goes along with that. But I thought we'd kick things off with me giving a very short demo, like 3 minutes, just to give folks watching a high-level overview of what exactly vulnerability and exposure management is. So why don't I uh, why don't I just do that real quick? We'll get that out of the way, and then I just want to get your feedback on all this.
Yeah, sounds good.
So, for those of you that are new to Sevco, this is the Sevco um, management platform. It's all cloud-based. And what we're seeing in this dashboard, I'm not going to go through all the details because we're just going to be very specific to vulnerability exposure management, is on the top left, we have a total of 13,771 devices. Okay, great. Well, let's drill down into that just a little bit more to give us some context where this is coming from. So we're making API calls to CrowdStrike, Jamf, Amazon, Tenable, all sorts of sources. We see 37,000 plus records, but that's all reduced down to actually 13,771 physical devices or virtual devices. So now we look at our live inventory, devices, users, vulnerabilities. I'm just going to go to devices now. And we see every device, every one of those 13,000 plus devices, and we see where we're pulling information from, CrowdStrike. In this case, nothing from Automox, nothing from Jamf. And we can pull up some particulars, like here's the actual one specific device here. It's Latitude 5450. The last time it spoke to one of these sources was 11 minutes ago. Looks like that was CrowdStrike. We see if there's any CVEs and any KEVs, configuration issues. We know it's a critical asset. It's on-prem. It's in Minneapolis. What user or users are associated with it. And then about controls, it's got endpoint, no config management. It's in directory services. And look at this. It's actually going to be an end-of-life device on October 7th. We can get more device details as well. So we can look at what everything would tell us if we looked at just at CrowdStrike or just Active Directory or just Sentinel-1. And we see everything that's being correlated now to create sort of this information. And this is great, but I could log on to CrowdStrike and get this detail. What I like is the aggregate on the left. All my environmental variables like configuration patch management, all my CVE, so my software vulnerabilities, and then of course, all that great asset intelligence together. So essentially all the asset, all the vulnerability, all the exposure stuff in one view. But now let's flip it. Let's look at it from the vulnerability side. We see on the top, we have almost 9,000 vulnerabilities. I'll just take this one on top. Google Chromium V8 type confusion vulnerability. We see the CVS's base scores, temporal scores, EPS's probability. There's 13 known exploits. We're completely integrated with BoneCheck out of the box. So we get a lot of rich intelligence added, including the patch information as well. But let me show you some of the richness that you get. So if we click on full details, I love this view because it says, hey, regarding this exploit, is it publicly available? Is it commercial? Meaning, can I buy it like on the dark web? Is it just a white paper or has it actually been weaponized like a Python script or a Metasploit plugin and all the related sources for that, which is cool. And then again, all the descriptions on the left, 13 known exploits, different threat actors, and a bunch of information from CISO. Now I can look at all the affected devices, or I can go over here and just look at more detail. So for example, reports from CISA, from Volcheck, from NSA. I'll click on this NSA one. Here we have a Chinese state-sponsored APT report that this APT happens to use the specific exploit as well. And because it's a Google device for Chrome, we know that's going to affect Chromium in versions 11 and 10. It looks like here. We see temporal scores, base scores, again, probability, all that information aggregated into one nice, concise view. Now let's look at it from exposures. So instead of looking at it from a CVE, let's say no endpoint protection, no patch management, end of life. I'll take this first one, endpoint protection that we have here. So in this case, it's a critical level severity. We're working on 32. We haven't snoozed any. 32 issues have been accepted. We've resolved 122. We're tracking it, and it's tied to ServiceNow. Great. We also have other ancillary information such as observation, impact, recommendation, and by the way stuff. Like, by the way, half of your devices are missing config and patch management, something you might be happy to know. Now we've got some stats on the right here. There's 588 issues that need your attention of 2,047 that have this issue, right? Over the last 30 days, 112 devices have popped up in this, 9 have been resolved. And normally resolution takes you about 2 weeks. Now, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but now you have some metrics around it. And I like this portion here. This is what we like to call remediation validation. This is this notion of, hey, I found 500 issues. I kicked over to IT to patch or maybe make some changes or people to install EDR or resolve CVE by doing something, whatever the case might be. and you say, oh, wow, it looks like you resolved a bunch, but there's still 100 here that you haven't resolved. And they said, oh, yeah, yeah, we're going to get to that in a couple of weeks. And that's great. But now you have a way to track that in real time. And that's just a native capability because of the API. And then, of course, the last bit is the metrics. When Jason resolves an issue, it takes 3 hours. When Brian resolves an issue, it takes 3 months. What's wrong with Brian? Wrong processes, wrong tools, maybe not enough training, whatever the case might be. But now you have these metrics about how well you're doing. And I really think that kind of brings everything together. So anyways, Jason, I just wanted to give everybody a quick little overview of what exposure
Yeah,
management is before we start talking about it, right? Because they're
yeah,
like,
for
well, what
sure.
is this stuff?
Yep,
So, Jason, let me just kick it off because when people think about vulnerabilities, a lot of folks will think about, well, a vulnerability scanner, which it makes
right.
sense, and pulling CVE. So I've got a list of IP addresses and their associated vulnerabilities. Uh, you know, Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, and a million others, right? But it's
Right.
not just scanners that pull CVE. So I'm just wondering from, you know, with what your organization does, you have this, really vast reach. What are some of the sources that you're getting CVEs from today?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the traditional sources, like you mentioned, are still great sources. There's still a lot of great data. So pulling that CVE data from your vulnerability management platform is great. But that information is also being populated by other security tools. So, today, both in my environment and clients that we're helping manage this problem, we're seeing this EDR now and other security tools are kind of populating that CVE data if they have knowledge of it.
Yeah,
But there's also a lot of, I guess, kind of open source intelligence sources where this data is coming from as well. So like, ISACs and CISA and the KEV, those are all sources of vulnerability data as well.
yeah.
Yeah, so that in of itself is a challenge because now there's not a single source to go and validate this data. It's coming from a lot of different sources.
Yeah. It's a lot like the SIM side, right? Where you say, I want to correlate firewall and IPS and syslogs from my
Right.
Unix servers and all this. Well, on this side of the house, you want to correlate all your CVE and vulnerability information, software vulnerability, plus all your exposure stuff, like my EDR is old,
Right.
my patch management installation is not even installed, my segmentation solution hasn't
Yep.
communicated with the management console in 3 months, right? All these
Yep.
types of variables, and
Right.
it's that same notion, right?
Yeah.
Aggregate, normalize, correlate, yeah, so on.
Yeah. For
Um,
sure. And I've also seen where like a lot of vulnerability assessment, and that I feel like that's an area still that gets overlooked today is um when people start talking about vulnerability management technologies, they're typically talking about the scanner or the assessment. And those nothing against those technologies and those tools, but in many cases, they're doing unauthenticated assessments of devices. And they're reporting on CVE data that may or may not be factual and correct based on the information that they're trying to ascertain from the asset. This is where the vulnerability correlation. So if you have a platform that can now take that data and correlate it with other vulnerability sources that may have more detailed information, like your EDR or another source, and correlate and validate that data, it becomes pretty powerful.
yeah, no, great points. Jason, your organization works with emergency services groups all over the country. I think you
Right.
probably manage more than any other entity in the world, and a whole bunch of other things. Also, a lot of gaming organizations. So
Right.
organizations that are, I guess, one, important, and two, probably targets, right? So
Yep.
there's high stakes, I guess, is the best way to put that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
in the past, because I know this is an issue that's been important, even before Sevco came along, but in the past, how have you managed all the vulnerabilities and then the patching and how you prioritize? How'd you get your arms around that historically?
Yeah, I think that well, I mean, I think it started in the same way that everyone else is doing it. It's you have it's a little bit of a data and a process problem. So you have a significant amount of data that is typically point in time. So by the time you even look at the data, it's typically somewhat stale. And then you're typically manually correlating that data and trying to um, gain some kind of insights and intelligence out of that data. So typically, we see many organizations, and the way we were doing it when we first got into this side of the business was, I mean, massive data analysis with fundamentally spreadsheets and pivot tables.
Mm.
And you're doing a bunch of data analysis and manual data science on data that's already stale. I think you brought up a great point with you were able to immediately see when was the last time this data was collected. And I think in the example you just used, it was fairly recent. But being able to differentiate that from the various different sources and see how old the data is to make sure that you're working with current data. But anyway, that's how we've been doing in the past, was basically manually correlating that data. And at the end of the day, there's only so much value you can get out of that.
All you had to say was a lot of Excedrin. We got through it with
Yeah.
pivot tables and a lot of,
Yep, that's right.
so we've talked a lot about the technical bits and bytes, and I think
Yep.
probably most of our viewers get that, and that makes sense. But there's also the business context, right? Especially for your organization that's providing managed services, right? Understanding, what networks might be critical or what geos and things like.
Right.
How do those business bits, correlate with all the technical parts?
Oh, I think the business context is arguably the most important component of this whole problem that we're all trying to solve on the cybersecurity side. Having that context and being able to, like in our case, we're using Sevco now and its dynamic tagging capabilities to create tags to associate business context with assets,
Mm.
and to be able to correlate that with vulnerability exposure. It's pretty significant. So now being able to tag things to like specific geographies or departments or assets. And, there's also the notion of like, what assets are most critical, crown jewels, et cetera, what things are in certain networks, if they're, in a DMZ or externally facing versus they're very deep and layered in. And there's all kinds of compensating controls in place and defense in depth. That's context that's missing in general if you're just looking at CVE data.
Yeah, yeah, great point, great point. And there's a lot of people, and I certainly support this notion that, a CVSS score does not equal your risk score, right?
Right.
Just because one device is a 10 and one device is a 5, it doesn't mean you address the 10 first. And a lot of that derives from the environmental issues and variables as well as the business context. So well
Yep.
stated on that, Jason. Well, let's double click a little bit. So, how valuable is using Sevco to validate the risk and actually remediate these issues? Let's get to the other side of it, not just say here it
Yeah.
is, but let's get rid of it.
Yeah, that's for sure extremely critical. It's not just a matter of knowing about the dangers and the risk and the threats. It's really being able to measure. I mean, that whole piece that you were just showing where you can see the response time actions on how long it's taking to remediate things. Another item that you pointed out that's super critical is when you were showing the exposure with a certain number of assets missing. I think in your example it was EDR. And there's a static number. And if you're just looking at on a, maybe a rolling 30-day window, that number, it's potentially possible that number is getting larger on a case-by-case basis. And that leads a lot of executives or other people that may be viewing that information to really ask and say, well, wait a minute, how is this getting better?
Yeah.
That key piece was that second data element, which you showed how it's changed with since the last time it was reported on. So how much of that exposure has been remediated? So you may have net new exposures, but if you're not also correlating that with exposures that have been remediated, you're really missing a critical part of your scoring, or you're not demonstrating the action that was taken. And that speaks directly to risk reduction for an organization.
Yeah. Well, and Jason, the last question I really wanted to hit you with before we wrap up here is simply this. You have a huge number of customers that you're applying, valuable services to. You have a finite number of people to do this, right? You're not gonna
Right.
quadruple your team every quarter. Um, how important is it just for general business operations to have metrics tied to this type of data? So you're understanding really, what my exposure window is. Did we mitigate that in 2 days, 2 hours, 2 months, 2 years, how, and then when you get those, does that work back into as a leader, into your process in terms of how you hire and train and deploy? Does that become part of the core business operations?
Yeah. So of course, all those KPIs and metrics to me, are some of the most meaningful metrics from when you're speaking to things like risk reduction and how you're handling your vulnerability exposure. And so from a cybersecurity risk and dashboards and things like that, those are all meaningful KPIs that CISOs and other security leaders care about. But you bring up a great point, is there's the flip side of that coin, which is all those KPIs and metrics can be used to also drive improvements in your own operational processes. So, looking at remediation and how things are being actioned on by, depending on, in my case, by a tenant by tenant basis or a client by client basis, or specific engineers. So it allows for very targeted training to do improvements and to refocus and maybe reprioritize resources on the actions and items that need to be focused on. So in general, it's providing overall risk reduction for us and for our clients. But it's also providing that super specific KPIs that help ascertain and determine next steps and actions to improve and help individual SOC analysts and security engineers to get better, and help us to scale. So at the end of the day, none of us have a money tree in our backyard that we can go shape. So if we can basically do more with less, that's a net win for all of us.
Yeah. Well, so well stated from somebody that's actually in the trenches doing this day in and day out, not just from a technical perspective, but managing, a pretty robust team. I know this is a topic that you're just super passionate about. So as we wrap up, any last things you'd like to say just about vulnerability exposure management in general?
Yeah, just overall, I could not be more excited to see what you guys are doing today from Sevco to help drive this. I mean, at the end of the day, I think this is the wrapper that's helped making not only all the technologies that we've all invested in the past better, but it's helping make our teams better. It's helping make us more efficient. I think this is arguably the missing sauce that we've all been missing for years to help drive significant efficiencies and improvement in the way that we're doing overall vulnerability lifecycle management. And we're able to apply our finite amount of security resources to the problems that matter most and impact the business the most. And I'm super excited to see what you guys are doing today, and what you guys keep surprising me with new improvements with what you're doing. And I'm excited to see how it plays out over the next few years.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate that. And we try our best. Jason, thank you so much. This has been great. Really, thank you so much for spending some time with everybody.
For sure. Thanks, Brian.